Hi everyone. Today we will learn about the 3-2-1 note-taking strategy. This strategy will help us make our thinking visible and structure our responses when analyzing a text, film, or lesson in social studies class. We will identify 3 takeaways, 2 things we are wondering about, and identify 1 thing we want to learn more about. This strategy can come in handy when being asked by your teachers to identify the main idea of a text. For the purpose of this lesson, we will use Unit 2, Day 27, the role of women in the Revolutionary War, but you can apply this strategy when analyzing any text in class. The setup is simple. In our physical or digital notebooks, I want you to set up your notebook to look like the following. We will split the top half of our notebook to have enough space for our 3 takeaways, and on the right-hand side for our 2 wonderings. On the bottom, we will write 1 thing we want to learn more about. Once we set up our notebook, our next step is to select our source. I've chosen to analyze the Introduction to the Role of Women in the Revolutionary War lesson from Unit 2. Now we will read and annotate the text. Because we are practicing close reading, it may be beneficial to read the excerpt a few times. Remember, we are looking for takeaways, wonderings, and thinking about what we want to learn more about. We want to gather the gist and the tone of the text. We want to be an active reader and think about the author's claim and evidence they use to support their claim. At the start of the American Revolution in 1775, women were as deeply concerned and committed to the cause on both sides as the men who are more regularly celebrated in popular history. Thousands of women also suddenly found themselves living in a war zone. They endured years of hardship, and many lost everything as the American and British armies battled across the continent. Some women became the head of the household when their husbands left for the war, while others became camp followers of the Continental Army and actively contributed to the success of the American cause. Loyalist women became spies in New York. Without the efforts of women on both sides of the Revolutionary Divide, the war would have progressed very differently. The upheaval of the Revolutionary era also provided women with opportunities to challenge the status quo of colonial society. Phyllis Wheatley and Elizabeth Freeman both pushed for enslaved Black colonials to gain the same freedoms claimed by the writers of the Declaration of Independence, while Deborah Squash and Peggy Gwynne emancipated themselves and joined hundreds of other Black enslaved people trying to escape to freedom in Canada when the British evacuated at the end of the war. Nadia Ward, like other Native American leaders, strived to use the revolution to carve out new opportunities for her people to survive and thrive under the ongoing threat of colonization and oppression. The experiences of the revolution would reverberate for years to come and shape a new ideal of American womanhood. So now I'm going to look back on the text and I'm going to think about my graphic organizer and identify 3 things that I learned. Something that can also be helpful is using the highlight function to highlight important takeaways that we can also note in our graphic organizer. The 3 things that I want to identify in my graphic organizer are many women had more independence during the American Revolution than before. I also noticed that Loyalist women became spies in New York and worked as spies. On the second page of the reading, I noticed that some women work to improve lives of Black Americans and Native Americans regardless of gender. So now I'm going to take the time and write 3 things that I learned in my graphic organizer. So now that I've made my thinking visible on the left-hand side of my graphic organizer, I want to write 2 things that I wonder about. So I'll take some time to go back to the reading. And one of the things that I'm thinking about from the second page of the reading is who are Elizabeth Freeman, Phyllis Wheatley, Deborah Squash, Peggy Gwynne, and Nadia Ward. I'm introduced to them in this paragraph, but I want to learn more about them. How were their lives impacted after the war? I'm also thinking about power dynamics. And did the power dynamic of men and women shift permanently or revert back to how things were before the war? So now I'll take some time and I'll record these two wonderings in my graphic organizer. All right, so now we have taken the time to write 3 things that we have learned, 2 things that we wonder about, and our final step is to write 1 thing you want to learn more about. For example, on my graphic organizer, I wrote, what specific opportunities did Nadia Ward work to provide for Native Americans? Okay, now it is your turn. And remember that you can apply this strategy to lots of readings, films, or lessons that you are learning about in social studies class.